I want to start off by reading in Esther chapter 4, verse 1. Just want to give a little, you guys are very, I don't have to tell you guys the story because you know the story in and out. But um, so Haman had just convinced King Xerxes, or also known as Ab Ahasuerus, to kill the Jews. It was a horrible thing that was going to happen. And Mordecai was really distraught about it. And it says in verse 4, chapter 1, it says, when Mordecai perceived all that was done, Mordecai rent his clothes and put on sackcloth with ashes, and he went out into the midst of the city and cried with a loud and bitter cry, and came even before the king's gate, for none might enter into the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. In every province, wheresoever the king's commandment and his decree came, there was a great mourning among the Jews, and fasting and weeping and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. So Esther's maids and her chamberlains came and told it to her. Then was the queen exceedingly grieved, and she sent raiment clothed to Mordecai, and to take away his sackcloth from him. But he received it not. Chapter 5. Then called Esther for Hatach, one of the king's chamberlains, whom he had appointed to attend upon her, and gave him a commandment to Mordecai, to know what it was and what it was, and why it was. So Hatach went forth to Mordecai under the street of the city, which was before the king's gate. And Mordecai told him of all that had happened unto him, and to the sum of the money that Haman had promised to pay to the king's treasuries for the Jews, to destroy them. And he gave him the copy of the writing of the decree, and that was given at Shushan, to destroy them, to shew it unto Esther, and to declare it unto her, and to charge her that he should go in unto the king, to make supplication from him, to make request before him for her people. And Hatach came and told Esther the words of Mordecai. Again Esther spake unto Hatach, and gave him commandment unto Mordecai. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces do know that whosoever, whether man or woman, shall come unto the king into the inner court, who is not called, there is one law of his, to put him to death, except such to whom the king shall hold out the golden scepter, that he may live. But I have not been called, this is Esther, I have not been called to come into the king these 30 days. And they told Mordecai Esther's words. Mordecai commanded to answer Esther, think with thyself not that thou shalt escape in the king's house, more than all the Jews. For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise in the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. And who knoweth whether thou art come to the king for such a time as this? And I just want to stop right there. Jesus, Lord, let your word come forth in this message today. For every heart here today, God, let your word go forth, and let me be a vessel, God, to show someone your meaning, Jesus. In Jesus' name, thank you, Lord. So let's give a backdrop here. 70 years, or actually probably later than 70 years prior, Daniel and a lot of the children of the wise men of Israel were carried off to Babylon. And so the great Babylonian Empire existed at that time, but then it fell. And the Medes and the Persians came, and they took away the Babylonians, and they took command of all the territory that used to be Babylon. History says that the great Persian Empire went from what is now India all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. Great. There was actually 127 provinces. basically the known world, civilized world, was under the command of Xerxes. And here is Esther. She was a orphan. We know that because we know her cousin Mordecai had raised her. Her father and her mother were dead. She was all by herself. So Mordecai, feeling the need to protect her, he actually raised her and protected her. And one day the Lord had a strategy that Esther could have never imagined. One day there was a decree sent out because Vashti, the queen of Xerxes at the time, let me pronounce his name with the Hebrew tongue. It's Ahasuerus, I think. So we'll use the Hebrew tongue. Xerxes was his Persian name, but the Jews called him Ahasuerus. So Ahasuerus sent out a decree that he wanted a new queen because Vashti had rejected him. At this time, the positive treatment the Jews received under the Persian Empire makes the narrative of Esther seem quite surprising. At the same time, the text reveals the flippantness of the king. Ahasuerus, also known as Xerxes, ruled over the Persian Empire. The book of Esther portrays the king as capricious, buffoonish, and even depictable. So we would call it, he's very easily led on. Let's just put it straight out there. Haman had actually, he was easily manipulated. That's what I think of. No one knew the depths of his disappointing nature like Queen Vashti. During a showcase of his kingdom featuring multiple parties of feasting and drinking, the king demanded that Vashti appear before him and the men attending his party. Vashti refused. The story of Esther provides us with the key insights into what happened, into his character. When Vashti refused to appear before him, the king's advisors convinced him that the actions of this one woman would affect all of the women in the kingdom. If she doesn't do what you tell her to, what do you think is going to happen to all the Lord's wives in the kingdom? Remember, there were 127 provinces. So whatever affected the king was going to affect everyone else. So Xerxes or Ahasuerus, he listened to his advisors and he said, okay, I'm going to have to banish my queen. When Vashti refused to appear before him, the king's advisors convinced him that actions of one woman would affect all the women in the kingdom. If the queen did not obey her king, then widespread rebellion of women against their husbands would break out in the empire. The exaggeration of these advisors and the king's banishment of Vashti reveals how poor his judgment was. The king acted despicably, and Vashti paid the price. So he was very wishy-washy. I would say that he wasn't a good leader, because a leader should have the final word and know what the right answer was. But you know what? This was part of God's plan. If Vashti hadn't rejected the king and his advisors hadn't convinced him that she needed to be banished, then we may not have ever heard of that Esther. And we may not even be talking about that Bible today, because far and wide, the Jewish people might have been distinguished from this earth, but God wasn't going to allow that to happen. Although the Jews faced genocide in the book of Esther, the Persians generally treated the Jews favorably. After defeating the Babylonians, Cyrus the Great, which was the first king of Persia, let them go back to their homeland, let them rebuild their temple. But there was a small enclave of Jews that stayed behind. The setting is Shushan. This is a very vibrant, probably, I would say, the center of the Persian Empire. This is where all the trade and commerce, where the king's palace was at. These people decided to stay behind. This is something that a lot of us don't realize. A lot of Jews had already gone back home, but there was this group of people that still remained in the Persian Empire. After the king's wrath waned and servants sought virgins to possibly serve. So here the decree goes out. Vashti has been removed from the palace and she's been excommunicated, I guess you could say. Esther found herself chosen. And I really don't think she had a choice. I don't know if it says it for sure, but I think pretty much when the king said to do so, I think all women that weren't married and were virgins were required to report to the palace. Esther found herself chosen. I don't think she wanted to do it, but she was told by Mordecai, and he said, "Don't reveal who you are," because in the Bible we read that her name was Hadassah. That was Esther's true name. She was of the tribe of Benjamin, and she was truly Jewish. But at this time, it was not popular. So Mordecai forbade her, and he said, "Don't reveal your Jewish heritage." So Esther obeyed Mordecai, entered into the chamber of the women on a secret mission from God that she herself did not even realize. Esther knew the difficulty she faced. Jews were being persecuted in foreign lands, and obeying Mordecai and keeping her identity hidden seemed like the best course of action. Still, Esther wondered how everything would turn out. Following Mordecai's advice, she proved exceedingly beneficial. As a result, Esther trusted in the guidance of Haggai, the king's chamberlain, the keeper of the women. While many of the other women demanded lots of items before going into the king's chamber, Esther simply took what Haggai had appointed. This is one thing that I want to really emphasize. Even though Esther gave up her identity, she didn't give up her identity as a daughter of the king, because it showed in how she treated people. This is the way she was able to persuade people on her side, is because her heart was still genuine. She never lost who she was. Esther's kindness and her good demeanor caused her to gain favor from everyone who saw her. The king saw her worth and made her his queen. It wasn't necessarily her looks. The Bible does say that she was attractive, but it also was her heart. Haggai I believe I'm pronouncing this right. He was the eunuch that was over in charge of the harem. He became to really admire her. The king admired her. I don't know how many women were in that harem, Brother Grant, but I could imagine it's the most powerful empire on earth, that there might have been 1,000 women that was in that palace. And she rose to the top because that was God's plan. Esther faced the tough reality of being taken from her home, being forced to keep her identity secret, and being placed in a competition for queenship. God still worked in her situation, although as Ahasuerus proved to be an extremely capricious king, the Almighty proved faithful to Esther. In some way, we must recognize God's ability to work in situations, no matter how strange and onerous they are. So Haman came on the scene, and Haman, we know, was a son of he was a member of the family of Agagite, which, if you know the story. If we go back to Psalms chapter 1, or First Samuel chapter 15, if you guys want to flip over to chapter 15, and you know the story when that help me out, Brother Grant, the Algamites. Let me get to that. Hold on a second. Haman exasperated the difficulties for Esther and Mordecai. Ahasuerus had proven extremely pliable in the situation with Vashti. So Haman was very insidious. He saw that the king Xerxes was very easily swayed. He saw that Queen Vashti had created a situation and he saw that the king was easily convinced to remove his queen from the palace and to excommunicate her. So Haman thought, well, this will be my opportunity. He didn't like the Jews at all. And the reason why, if we look back in the first chapter of Esther, is that Mordecai did not respect Haman. Haman expected everyone to bow to him, and Mordecai didn't bend a knee, and I really like that about him. Because as you know, if you were truly a believer of God, you don't bow your knee to no man. You bow your knee to God. And this really got in Haman's mind, and it stirred, and he had evil thoughts about what he would do. He didn't want to just punish Mordecai. He wanted to remove and exterminate all the Jews from the earth. Thankfully, God had a plan, and Esther had hidden her pedigree as a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. King Saul, the day that he had didn't do what he was supposed to, and he was supposed to kill the Amalekites. And you guys know the story. I'm going to move over. Hang on a second. Bear with me. Lord help me. So we're on First Samuel, chapter 15. So as you know, it says, chapter 2. Let's chapter 5, verse 2. Chapter 15, verse 2. Everybody with me still? Chapter 15, verse 2. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, I remember that which Amalek did to Israel, and how he laid wait for him in the way, and he came up from Egypt. Now go and smite the Amalek, and utterly destroy all that they have, and spare them not, but slay both men and women, infant and suckling, ox and sheep, camel and ass. And Saul gathered the people together and numbered them in Telaim, 200,000 footmen and 10,000 men of Judah. And Saul came to a city of Amalek, and laid wait in the valley. And Saul said unto the Canaanites, Go, depart, get you from among the Amalekites, lest I destroy you from them, for ye show kindness to the children of Israel. When they came up out of Egypt, so the Kenites departed from among the Amalekites, and Saul smote the Amalekites from Havel unto thou comest to Shur, and that is over against Egypt. And he took Agag, the king of the Amalekites, alive, and utterly destroyed all the people with the edge of the sword. So let me stop right there. He was told by God to destroy everything, and he didn't. He defied God. And he spared Agag, and the best of the sheep and the oxen, and of the fatlings and the lambs, and all that was good, and would not utterly destroy them. But everything that was alive, that was vile and refuse, that they destroyed utterly. Then came the word of the Lord unto Samuel, saying, It repenteth me that I have set up Saul to be king, for he is turned back from following me, and hath not performed my commandments. So we see the story set right here. He allowed Agag to survive, and he didn't kill all the Amalekites. Well, guess where Haman comes from? Here we are, centuries later, and something that didn't get removed from the presence of the children of the church, or of the children of Israel, is still there. So God had a plan for Esther, because Haman was going to carry out what the Amalekites would have done if they hadn't been removed, because he knew their heart. The problem between the Jews and Haman arose over Mordecai's refusal to bow down. As a result, Haman blamed all the Jews for the behavior of one Jew. Remember, Haman is in the line of the Amalekites. Racial hatred and ethnic strife often arise due to terrible stereotypes. So Haman had spread these lies, and he was going to manipulate the king to do a great atrocity. Kind of like what has happened in history with the Nazis. We know what the Nazis did. I think the devil wanted to remove the children of God from this earth. But I know God wasn't going to allow that. And this is when Esther appeared on the scene. Haman's utter disdain for Mordecai led to him to formulate a plan to destroy all the Jews. Obtaining the permission of the fickle king, let's just say instead of fickle, I like the word, he's very easily swayed. He's a very he's not set on his ways. It proved easy for Haman. In his discussion with the king, Haman used the language that racists often use. He said, these certain people who did terrible things in the empire, Haman lacked no proof, but the king believed him. The king lacked no wisdom and failed to care for his subjects. Unfortunately for the Jews and Mordecai, Ahasuerus, who also is Xerxes, allowed a death decree to be pronounced upon them. Haman cast Pur, which translates lots. So he basically said, okay, we're just going to take a lottery on what day we're going to kill the Jews. Can you imagine that? We're going to just randomly come up with this day. Haman was I'm sure he was excited that day because he could actually get rid of the Jews. To determine the date of disaster for the Jews, provincially, the timing presented a window to change the difficult situation for the better. Esther soon discovered, and this is where we pick up on chapter 4, Esther realized what Haman's plan was. And this is where she talked to Mordecai. Soon she discovered the problem, and her fellow Jews faced. Esther heard about her relative Mordecai, what he had done in response. And although Esther was wearing royal robes, Mordecai had ripped his robes. Although Esther had servants to ensure her garments were impeccably clean, Mordecai dressed in sackcloth and ashes. Esther remained safe in her palace while Mordecai sat in the king's gate and cried out bitterly. So I can imagine when the news came to Esther, she was horrified. But she was also scared too. She wanted to do the right thing, but she didn't know what to do. So she sent Haggai to go ask Mordecai, here, take these robes. This will help you feel better. I think that she wanted to do something, but she didn't want to do what she knew she had to do. And this is all going to come in our lives, right? If we have to stand up for something that is not popular, especially in this society, we're going to have that moment because that's when God is testing us. Due to her position of power and relationship with the king, Esther might have thought she could escape the decree of the king. But Mordecai, we read in chapter 4, said, Mordecai worked to convince Esther that she might have her position for another reason. As we read in Esther 4 and 14, who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Basically, Mordecai was saying, hey, I think this is the time. This is your divine time. This is what God's plan is. You have a connection to the king. Esther hadn't seen the king in 30 days. Can you imagine that? If your husband only saw you once a month. And we know that you could not enter, Brother Grant, you could not enter the king's throne room without being asked. If he said that you were to be killed, you were to be killed. If he extended his golden scepter, that meant, okay, you can come forward. But if he didn't do anything, guess what? You're gone. You're finished. And Xerxes was a very temperamental guy. He kind of was wishy-washy. He loved Esther, but he didn't really know. He didn't want to rock the boat either. He wanted to keep his position of power. So Esther told Mordecai, or told Haggai to go tell Mordecai, go tell him that I want him and all the Jews in Shushan to uh, fast for 3 days. Now, this is another interesting thing. Do you think Esther said, "Okay, I'm going to do the right thing. I'm on it"? No, the first thing she said is, "All my handmaidens are going to fast for 3 days. We're not going to eat. We're going to pray. I want you guys to fast for 3 days. All the Jews. This isn't. We're going to plead with God for his deliverance." So for 3 days, all the Jews of Shushan, the word had got out. They fasted and they prayed. And so did Esther. And this is another interesting thing. Her handmaids were probably not Jews. They may have been, they may not have been. Persia had a lot of ethnic groups in it. There was a wide diversity. But she got with people that may not have believed what she believed. And she said, look, this is what you're going to do. You're not going to eat for 3 days. I thought that was interesting. I always have something there. But sometimes we find ourselves in a safe place of blessing thanks to God's plan. But yet the Lord calls us to demonstrate our courage and step out by faith to reverse something terrible. The challenge may prove even more intense because we might have to stand up for someone else. Doing so would create a risk for us. Nevertheless, we must move outside our comfort zone and fully embrace the will of God. I think that today's day, or what we're going through today, is we haven't seen anything more like that than ever, because wickedness is, we know, it's becoming more mainstream. I was reading or watching a video yesterday, and it was talking about how many denominations are accepting homosexual union, or at least saying it's okay, and it's astounding. So one denomination after another today is following and saying it's okay. I know the Bible says this, but it's okay. And we see it in our society too. In politics, in the workplace, we all have to do special training. I've had to do it painfully, click through it. We have to be, we have to be careful what we say or how we say it. But we know that one day it might come to our doorstep. It might come to our doorstep about even saying the name of Jesus. It's already happening in the schools. It's already happening. I know people are losing their job, their positions, just because they say the name of Jesus. And it's not allowed. But that's the moment Esther was in. Esther and her maids, along with the Jews in Shushan, including Mordecai, fasted to help Esther prepare to save the people. Doing so allowed her to formulate a clever plan to counteract the evil scheme of Haman. The situation gave Esther her position. Her position had risen above the king's. The situation that gave Esther her position had risen above the king because the king had spent so much time partying. So what did Esther do? She had to think like the enemy. What would the king do? And the king likes to party. So she arranged a great feast for the king and Haman, because she knew that Haman liked to be. He had a sweet spot. He was very prideful. He liked himself. So she arranged this party, and in this great feast, let's just say it, the king probably got a little bit liquored up. Esther probably disdained it. I would imagine she didn't want to be at that party, because she didn't believe in drinking and alcohol, and because she was a loyal member of God or family of Israel. But the situation gave Esther her position, and she set up a party, a great party. Esther hoped that she could ply the king with feasting and drinking in order to help him hear her petition. Esther demonstrated tremendous wisdom in preparing a couple of feasts, so it was more than one, for both her husband and Haman. Esther understood how the king worked. Haman, however, proved himself more foolish than wise. He failed to realize what the true plan was. The beginning of Haman's downfall occurred when the king could not sleep. To alleviate his insomnia, the king asked the royal records to be read before him. The archive contained the story of Mordecai preventing an assassination attempt on Ahasuerus. When the king discovered that Mordecai had received no reward for his life-saving deed, he summoned Haman. Ahasuerus asked what would be done to the man whom the king delighted to honor. The presumptuous Haman assumed the king desired to honor him. Haman proposed to honor him by clothing him in the king's royal robes and parade him through the city on the king's horse, as someone proclaimed, "Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delighteth to honor." In one of the best scenes of poetic justice ever, the king commanded Haman to give this honor to Mordecai. I can imagine the look on Haman's face that day. A scowling, embarrassed Haman reluctantly led Mordecai through the city. Right before his enemies, God lifted up Mordecai. That's amazing. When you stand up for God, he's going to stand up for you. So here, Haman was trying to kill Mordecai and the Jews, and yet the king was swayed to honor the man that saved his life. Haman thought, was that me? That must be me. No, it was Mordecai. So in front of the whole crowd of the city, Mordecai was lifted to a high position. Esther would also succeed in her mission, not before Haman tightened the provincial noose around his neck. He had gallows built so he could execute Mordecai. Little did he know that those gallows would be where he died. Although some translations use the word gallows, the text most likely refers to a pole where Haman could impale his enemy. That's a horrible sight to think. Esther would put the final nail in Haman's coffin at the second banquet. Esther told the king of the pending destruction of her people. When the king discovered that Haman was the culprit, he decreed that Haman be impaled on the pole that he had prepared for Mordecai. So now Haman is getting his punishment for what he had done. The king, however, could not reverse the decree that he had said, or that against the Jews. So the king couldn't reverse the decree because it would be perceived as weak. So I have to think that there was a warning given, or that they would know the day. So the Jews defended themselves that day. So I can imagine it like this. There was 127 provinces in the Persian Empire, stretching from India to the Mediterranean. In every one of those provinces, it was decreed that Jews were to be killed. I can imagine in just regular individuals, there might have been a bounty, Brother Grant. There might have been a payment. There might have been some kind of reward to basically go out and kill your neighbors, people that you lived with, worked with. And this would have happened. But because Esther had intervened and Haman was killed, the Jews rose up and they actually were victorious. Everywhere in the kingdom, they fought against the people that were trying to kill them, and they were victorious. To this day, the Jews have the Feast of Purim, which is in February or March. And to this day, they actually celebrate it with a great feast. They have gift giving, and they stand in front of their peers and they talk about the day that Esther saved the children of Israel. So, I kind of echoed. So I think the point of this story is, and some people think, well, why does Esther fit in so well into this situation? When Saul failed to do what God had told him to, another tribe of Benjamin, because they were both from the tribe of Benjamin, rose up, and she did what God asked her to. Because God will always raise somebody up to do His will. It can be anybody. It can be a man. It can be a woman. It can be a child. It can be. You're never too old. You're never too young. God is going to raise somebody up to do His will. So I think that's the Esther is one of those stories where we really see that. We see it throughout the Bible with David. He was the least of his family, the least likely. I'd like to read this verse, and you guys are familiar with it. 1 Corinthians 1:27, a pretty familiar verse. Paul wrote, "But God has chosen the foolish things of this world to confound the wise." That always gives me chill bumps. "And God has chosen the weak things of the world to confound the mighty things, or the confound the things that are mighty." So God he's always looking ahead. He knows the end of the story, the first of the story. He always knows what's in store for us, just like Esther. So I just want to conclude there, and I hope everybody gleaned something from that. I think we're going to let out for prayer. So if you guys want to sit and pray for 5 minutes, or we got 5 minutes, I don't know. Thank you.